Thank you so much, David. Can everyone hear me? Good morning. So I want to start with a little poem, something I reach for quite often. Perhaps we are all immigrants, trading one home for another. First we leave the womb for air, then the suburbs for the filthy city, in search for a better life. Some of us just happen to leave entire countries. Does anyone know who wrote that? It wasn't me. That's by Ruchika Tulshyan. She's a #1 New York Times bestselling author. Growing up, I could never imagine a woman of color. She's an Indian origin woman in Canada, and the words #1 New York Times bestseller in the same sentence. I wish that my 8-year-old self could witness this. So when I was invited to give this talk about commitment, I had a million thoughts about what I could say about my commitment, mostly about what I've achieved or who I've interviewed as a journalist or the awards and recognition that I've gotten. And then I quickly realized that how I define commitment and reward is by the same measures that all good immigrants define themselves or are defined by our society. Upon reflecting more over the past weeks, inspired by many of my students at Seattle University, I realized my talk should be titled, How I Committed to Being a Bad Immigrant. So I use the word immigrant loosely. Anyone who has had to leave their homes, their families, everything familiar to them, to settle into a new land for any reason. And I know that the word immigrant is very loaded at this time in history. So I'm going to take you through my journey of being a bad immigrant and attempt to impart some of what I've learned along the way. And I plan to keep it brief because I'm really more excited to learn from you, especially in the Q&A. So are you ready? I'm an immigrant, in case you couldn't tell, but I have the unique and sometimes not so great distinction of being an immigrant every single place that I've lived. I was born in Singapore, a child of Indian immigrants. My parents achieved the immigrant dream, as you can imagine, that we're all familiar with in America. They came from nothing, and they couldn't even imagine the life that they would be able to create back home as they continued living in Singapore. They also overeducated their 3 children, of which I am the eldest. But until I was 4, I could not speak English properly. For a while, my teachers wrote me off as the typical child of immigrants. Some told my mother that I would never be able to read in English properly. My mom refused to accept this and committed herself tirelessly to teach me to read in English until I learned. And now when I think about my inability to read in English, I think of it as a plug in a dam. And once the plug was pulled out, water gushed out, unstoppable. My passion for reading was voracious. I read everything in sight, from Roald Dahl to Shakespeare to Enid Blyton to Charles Dickens before I turned 13, and also the dictionary, so you can imagine I didn't have a lot of friends in school. Escaping into these beautiful worlds also began a lifelong passion and commitment to storytelling. But when I look back at my characters, they looked nothing like me. They all had blonde hair and blue eyes, and ran down hills and wore coats. And if any of you have been to Singapore, you'll be marveling at my imagination right now. But reflecting back on these stories, I'm reminded of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's TEDx talk on the danger of a single story and what happens when you only interact with stories of a dominant majority. And storytelling came naturally to me. It was where I wanted to escape at every single spare moment. But children of good immigrants didn't become storytellers, I was told. They were A students, not only in English, but in math and science. They didn't become writers. They became bankers and lawyers and doctors. And even though some people I loved encouraged me to tell stories, I listened more to the voices that dictated what immigrants should be good for. And indeed, assimilating was the greatest dream of good immigrants. At 18, I assumed a new immigrant identity. I left Singapore to study in the United Kingdom. And despite the illusion of Western liberalism, the UK is actually very prescriptive of what good immigrants look like. I was among a small handful of international students who didn't study a science. and noticed how all of my friends who were immigrants or children of immigrants forced themselves to conform to the expectations of being good. I became the news editor of my college newspaper, but it never even occurred to me that writing about arts or culture was an option for someone like me. I never allowed myself to think of anything else but internships and getting good grades and a good job. And then even when I moved to New York a couple of years later to get a degree in journalism, master's in journalism, a good deviation already from the path that was laid out for me, I decided to pursue business journalism, the most respectable of all news professions in the eyes of my community. Over the years, I did many things that good immigrants do. I got into top colleges, got good grades, I spoke English without an Indian accent, and I had an arranged marriage. As a journalist, I remember meeting many of the business leaders I went to interview, largely white male CEOs, who would express surprise, usually thinly veiled, about what a good immigrant woman like me was doing interviewing them. I'd get overwhelmingly complimented on my English speaking abilities, and when people would assume I was born in America, I would quickly correct them. And that really became the first time that I started questioning this idea of a good immigrant. You see, by redefining an immigrant, that some of us spoke English very well, could have a master's degree in journalism, that we could be storytellers too, I was setting the foundation to becoming a bad immigrant. And so began my quiet commitment to changing the definition. But what really pushed me over the edge was my time in Seattle's technology scene. In tech, we all know what a good immigrant looks like. We do our work quietly. We don't demand recognition. We don't speak up. And we're not considered leaders. Well, I read Lean In, and I wasn't going to let anyone else dictate my career. But I slowly started realizing whenever I leaned in, I was called difficult to work with. And I realized that the ideas of leaning in and self-advocacy were not compatible with the idea of being a good immigrant. So shortly before I was being put up for a significant promotion, with 3/4 of my stock options on the table, I walked away from my last full-time job. Good immigrants I knew, all my family and many of my friends, thought I was crazy. I probably was. I left it all to tell stories full-time. And this time, not the way I did as a business journalist, not of successful people and of largely white men. No, that would be too much of being a good immigrant. In fact, I then started looking for stories of people we didn't read about. I wrote a book about the women who wouldn't get raises or promotions even when they did lean in, the mothers of color who were continually passed over for leadership positions, about how the tech industry was fueling the sex trafficking industry, and of the women who were called angry black women. Slowly but steadily, I began my descent from good to bad immigrant. I became a bad immigrant by becoming civically engaged, by calling out systemic racism, by refusing to work with organizations that had no people of color, by protesting and marching against institutional oppression, by talking about myself and learning to say no. By the way, if you really want to see what people think of you, certainly as an immigrant, and decide whether you're a good or bad immigrant, you'll find out by how many times a day you say the word no. And this time in history, with the political rhetoric we hear around us, I honestly don't see any other choice than the word no. I'd rather redefine the type of immigrant I am, even if some don't like the way I do it, even if I may face consequences for it, than stay silent. Don't get me wrong, by the way, I'm crazily grateful to Seattle and all the other homes I've had over the past years. I feel incredibly lucky. But if being a good immigrant simply means compliance, to never question, to not disrupt the status quo when you see wrongdoing, then I want no part of that definition. I'm far from being done. In fact, I would say I've just gotten started to becoming committed to owning my identity as a bad immigrant. Where in my past I measured myself by how much I was a good immigrant, how much praise I would get. Now I do it by how much I'm able to disrupt the existing expectations and create new categories for women, for people of color, and yes, immigrants. Not everyone in this room is an immigrant or a first-generation child of immigrants, but as I go over what I learned in my journey and commitment to becoming a bad immigrant, I hope you think about how this could apply to the commitments you make to yourself, to society, and to others. So I've titled this part of my talk, What I've Learned in Moving from Assimilation to Shaping Culture as a Bad Immigrant. Number one, those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind. I'm sure many of you have heard this saying. They say it takes 21 days to form a new habit, make a new commitment. In my experience, it takes about 21 conversations of people telling you you're crazy and you're doing the wrong thing for you to really set yourself on the right path. And over time, there were definitely people who were nearest and dearest to me who thought I was crazy from walking away from a job in tech, for a company that was really fast growing and later on went IPO. And it took a lot of conversation and talking through about a vision that I didn't even know what it would look like. There was just a feeling. But I started realizing that even for people who didn't really see the vision all the way, those who really cared about me, they still stood behind me. And that's really, really special. Number two, I learned that you can't do this alone. It's really important to find your allies and advocates. It's also important to find a cohort. So when I look around me at amazing immigrants in the Seattle community, there's so many, but the two I think of immediately are Leslie Feinzag, who is redefining, entrepreneurship for female founders with the founding of the Female Founders Alliance, and my friend Lean Kawas, who started M3 Biotechnology, an immigrant from Jordan, who is really redefining the biotech scene here in Seattle. And then there's obviously immigrants I don't personally know. The one that I look to is PepsiCo CEO Indra Nooyi, and not because she's running $1 billion business, but she's really talked very openly and freely about the guilt that mothers face, that working moms face. And that's pretty badass immigrant of her, if you ask me. And my two biggest champions are both immigrants. My mother, who at 21 immigrated to Singapore, her first time on a plane, and then built a life there. And my husband, an immigrant from India to the United States. And I've seen both of them become bad immigrants in the past few years, and it's pretty exciting. Watch that space. Number three, I've learned that the moment you want to give up is exactly when you shouldn't. I had so many of those, especially about a year into when I left my job, and I was like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if anyone cares about this. I don't know if storytelling is the right place for me. And all this while, I kept wondering if I'd made this giant mistake. But that's exactly when you shouldn't give up. You have to get really uncomfortable to really make a change. It's like you really need to keep pushing until you reach that level where you've had a breakthrough. And for me, a big part of that breakthrough was having readers, and then later on, as I got into teaching, students come up to me and say, it's incredible that by telling your stories, you're making space for our stories. The last thing I've learned is that it's really important to learn to adjust and expand and contract, but to always stay true to your values when you're making a commitment. I mentioned this earlier, but we are at a time in our histories where the rhetoric against immigrants is strong and divisive. So I want to ask you, how will you commit to do your part in changing the narrative about immigrants? I want to end with another poem. This one's by me. I was a good immigrant once. I never asked questions. I was a good immigrant once. I never raised my voice. I was a good immigrant once. I never expected more. I was a good immigrant once. I never spoke my mind. Then one day, the unthinkable happened, and I had two choices. I could stay a good immigrant, or I could commit to doing all the things I wasn't supposed to. I was a good immigrant once. Thank you so much for listening. You've been incredible. she wants me to ask my own self a question. This is really like being bad. So I was asked if being female and an immigrant conflates things. Is that correct? Conflates things. Yes, absolutely. And in fact, when I think of my next phase of life and my career, I find that if you have a conversation about being female without a conversation about intersectionality, it's not nuanced at all. So yes, being an immigrant, being a person of color, absolutely conflates a lot of the challenges and the expectations that were placed on me and that continue to be placed on me. I'll give you an example. So I'm an adjunct, at a university. I've been an adjunct at other universities too. And one conversation our department had is, when our students come see us or in class, should they call us doctor or professor, or should they call me Ruchika, or we have a Chris and we have a Jim and we have Johns, etc. And the men, by and large, went by their first name. They'd show up in shorts and obviously very storied. They had doctorates and they had been in their careers for years. But when they went by Chris or when they went by John or they went by James or whatever it was, rather than Dr. so-and-so, it didn't really make a difference on their evaluations. It didn't really make a difference on how they were perceived. Their authority on teaching a subject was never questioned. But for men of color in our department and for women of color specifically, not using the qualifier doctor or professor actually made a difference. And so we as a department, we're still sort of, and I can't speak for departments in general, but I think a lot of academic institutions are now starting to question, do we keep that formality? Because obviously you want people, especially in departments of communication, to be open and your students to feel ready to talk about anything, tell stories, be vulnerable. But if they're going to perceive you differently, just as a result of your gender, of your race, of your immigrant status, that makes a big difference. So absolutely, I think race and immigrant status absolutely conflates the challenges one would face as a female already. Thank you for that question. Are there more questions? Wow. Crickets. Oh, I see one right at the back. Hi.
So when you make that decision to leave your potentially very lucrative position,
yeah.
do you find that as you were making that decision that you were coming up against roadblocks trying to change something, or do you feel that you completely changed with that kind of impact going out into the world on your own?
Yeah, I faced roadblocks definitely internally when I decided to make the decision of leaving a full-time job. And I am a practical person and I'm surrounded by practical people. So I do caution those who haven't thought it through not to just jump in and leap into sort of the world or off the cliff. It was a very calculated decision, and it actually was, years in the making really, but specifically being in tech, I think did speed up that decision. And the internal roadblocks were obviously, what if I fail? What if nobody cares about this? What if people think less of me? What if I can never get back into a career, into a full-time job if this doesn't work out? So there were definitely a lot of internal roadblocks. I think the external, certainly, there were people, overall, even now, who are kind of like, what do you exactly do? And, what do you mean you tell stories? Or, they think, they think it's not really a career. And I found the internal challenges to be a lot more strong, and really I had to sit down and really work through a lot of it, and I still do. While I was writing my book, so this is me being really vulnerable. While I was writing my book, I used to wear a robe sometimes, and I would write it from my living room. I would work on my book from my living room. And then my sister in Singapore would FaceTime with me once in a while, or every couple of days, and she would start saying, "Oh, you're in your robe again," and I would feel so defensive. I'd be like, "It's a job. I'm working on a book. Like, come on," And then it got into this whole, and she was like, "Whoa." And then I started realizing it's actually me. I'm the one with the problem. Like she was just like being, funny or, commenting. She didn't realize like she was hitting a nerve with me feeling so insecure about this leap that I had taken, and and how we in our societies define productivity, right? Can you be as productive in a robe as you are, and when you're out in your tech job and your jeans and whatever? Yes, and let's not talk about clothing choices in tech. It's really tough to be a woman, an immigrant, a person of color, and try and dress for tech jobs. And I think a lot of women in the audience can nod along. I didn't even know what to wear to an interview. I turned up in basically a suit, and everyone's like, "What? What are you here for?" But yes, I hope that answered your question. I see. Okay, I think I see one right from the corner. So
you talked about finding allies and advocates.
Yes.
What was your how did you use discernment in that? Because it's really easy when you're trying to build community for me, let me speak for myself.
Yeah, no, please.
To give myself away.
Yeah.
In sort of seeking that. And
Yes.
how, especially as a woman, how did you get there?
Yeah. Yeah. I listened a lot more than I talked. And actually that is something, I think being an immigrant has actually been a really interesting experience here in the United States because, and I hear this again and again and again from international students that I work with, how do you get comfortable with talking about yourself? I'll be honest, I do a fair amount of public speaking, I teach classes, but one of the most nerve-wracking things for me was coming up here and talking about myself, so I'm not used to talking about myself. I like to tell other people's stories, I like to be a journalist, I like to show my data and research, but it's really hard for me to stand here and talk about myself. But I digress. Back to your question. Very much based on listening to what others say. And you'll start to get feelings about, okay, I think this person is someone who is in my tribe or belongs in my tribe or someone I'd like to get to know more about. I think it's also thinking about whether this is whether you can learn from this person. And I think as a woman, and we're talking about being women, we're very scared of relationships that might be transactional. And sometimes that means we hang on to relationships that really don't serve us. And as I've sort of thought more and more about what I want creativity to look like, I read a great quote, and I'm paraphrasing, I read a great quote, something like, Beyonce, when she did this awesome thing at Coachella, she could either be out there meeting people and hanging out with people all the time and saying yes to 100 different things, or she could say no to everything and work on being the Beyonce we saw at Coachella. And I'm starting to try and channel that in my life a lot more. Start saying yes to things and people that really matter, and no to things that I don't think serve me as well, so that hopefully I can work towards bringing a better version of myself. I'm not calling myself Beyonce at Coachella, but just to say that. Yeah. Yeah. Hi.
Do you think that immigrants, say from like Norway or Sweden, would have the same immigrant experience as from like Singapore or India?
Yeah. Great question. One of the different things that I do is I'm one of the founding editors on a intersectional feminist website called The Establishment, and we actually had an immigrant who went to Sweden at she lives in Sweden, and she wrote a story for us about how there was this growing backlash in Sweden against immigrants from other parts of the world, but not white immigrants like herself from America. And she laid it out really well and talked a lot about how so much of the sort of institutionalized oppression and the ideas of who we believe a good, a person who belongs in our community looks like, how much that plays into how we treat immigrants. One word I've tried very hard to kind of redefine is the word expat, right? So if you can go into a community and and you bring something special to that community, But also if you're white, you're considered an expat. And if you're not white, then no matter what you bring to that community, you're an immigrant. So I've really tried to work and done some writing actually trying to redefine that. So absolutely the perception differs. I'm sure you can see that in the way that our current administration qualifies who belongs in this country. In fact, very clearly defines, right, who really does and which countries belong in our country and which countries we should not be accepting immigrants from. And I really challenge you, as Seattle is a wonderful, wonderful place. We welcome, refugees. We welcome immigrants from all over the world. I challenge you to try and work towards redefining that, especially if you have the privilege of where you're considered. It's great for you to be here, and nobody's ever questioned you being here. So thank you. I think. Oh, there's a question. Okay, so let me go there, and then I'll come back to you. So.
You mentioned your sister's building in Singapore.
Yes.
Are issues of gender equality different in Singapore than they are in the United States?
Yes, great question. Are the issues of gender equality different? So Singapore is actually very unique in the sense, it's unique in so many different senses. I don't know if you've been following the news. We're going to be hosting the Trump-Kim summit in June. So we're a very unique country in Asia as it is. And in terms of gender equality, I've found that in Singapore that we've seen so many women be part of the government. We've seen so many people lead. We have more women in government and more women in senior executive roles than we see here in America. So I think professionally women do very well. I think the nuance comes in, and again, this is a conversation we have more in Singapore than we've had in America in all these years that I've lived here, where class and race really define how far women can get. So the Chinese majority women are really able to succeed in society. And then when you talk about intersectionalism, there's very little space for women who identify as LGBTQ or are openly gay. When you talk about class issues and how that bakes into things, it breaks down differently. But I think in Singapore, what I like and what I appreciate is that these conversations are a lot more open. I think in America, when I started talking about the experience of women of color being different from the experience of white women, I faced a lot of pushback. Is any country in the world, including an Iceland or Sweden or Norway, perfect? No, not when it comes to gender equality. And I think part of that is the target will always keep moving when you think about equality and equity. So, yeah, I did want to, hi.
If you could shout the answer. Apparently they've reused a 747 engine as the HVAC system.
Oh, yeah.
So
okay, yeah.
Really hard to hear.
Oh,
right here.
sorry about that.
So the question, I'm at that frightful spot where I have to go to a high school reunion.
Ooh.
Now, thanks to the magic of Facebook, I have learned that all the people I grew up with have politics that are somewhere to the right of Mussolini.
I'm sorry.
They talk a lot about immigrants. They have never seen one other than themselves, which goes back a few generations. Their family trees don't fork. How do you begin a conversation with these people about immigrants and not get shot? Because that's what I'm trying to face. And I can't just sit there quietly,
Yeah.
not in my genetics,
Yeah.
and not respond to them. But if I say what I really think, they'll just tune me out because it's too much all at once. So how do you begin these conversations with people who are, whose brains are so completely different that, I don't know, for me, I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, yeah. So
Remember to yell.
the good immigrant, see, I'm really kissing the mic. The good immigrant in me would have said, well, look at the amazing statistics of what immigrants bring to this country, and you can shout off all those statistics on how much we contribute to the economy and the changes we're making here that are positive. How many companies were started by immigrants, et cetera. So that would be the good immigrant answer. The bad immigrant answer that I've recently started realizing is I don't understand why we need to start qualifying our reason to be here. Why do we need to qualify our reason to be humans? Why is it that to be an immigrant, we should only be the CEOs, or we should be bringing in this much into the economy, or we should be the ones who are setting an example, and this is why we belong here. And I think it's really about trying to change that conversation from that step one, which is, okay, we really do bring a lot to the economy, we contribute, we are great for the American society, and moving from that conversation to we're humans. We're humans. This is really, at a human level, it's the right thing to do. And we should not have to qualify or talk about how great we are, right? It shouldn't be that this Harvard graduate did blah, 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 right, and is an immigrant. It should be this immigrant who's, paying their taxes and loves to sing or loves to write or loves to be creative. And I think what will really shift the conversation, I can't speak for people who are very, very stubbornly into that world, but I can definitely say this. I think the conversation will start to shift when we start seeing immigrants as human beings. And one statistic that really concerns me is that, and I've said it quite a few times recently, is 3/4 of white Americans do not have a single friend of color. And I see this in my son's daycare, right? I have a toddler, and his daycare is extremely diverse. I picked that by design. But I see that while the kids play together, when the parents come for pickup, the white parents only talk to each other, and it's the other parents of color who will come and talk to me and ask me how your day is. So it starts at a very young age, and I really think the way to shift that is to bring in people of color into your conversations, make us part of your tables, break bread with us. We have great food, I can tell you that. There's no simple answer. We're undoing centuries of institutionalized racism is the short answer, I think. So. One more question is what I've been told. I think, yes, gentleman in black.
So how do you feel is like the best way to start changing culture?
Mm-hmm.
Go along with what he's saying. I'm actually from the South, so I'm used to that. But coming into Seattle, I've only been here for about a year so far, and I feel like there's a lot more acceptance. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's still a lot of problems, especially I'm most familiar with tech scenes. That's what But I feel like a lot of us talk in circles that we all kind of agree with each other. But how do we go out and start to engage people who don't agree with us? And would you suggest that? And how would be the best way to go about that? Also, in your success state, would you ever consider your success state with a paradigm of bad immigrant and a good immigrant switch, where the bad immigrant is one who doesn't try to challenge the status quo, where good immigrants no, view me as a person who is contributing and just trying to get treated like everybody else?
Yeah, both great questions. So I'll go with your first question. I actually moved from the South, so I moved from the first question is, he talked about being from the South, and he said obviously Seattle's pretty liberal and accepting, but what would I suggest in getting us even further into these conversations with immigrants and changing the culture? So on that note, I actually moved from the South, and what I liked about the South, I was an immigrant there. Most people did not know where Singapore was from, including some of the Fortune 500 CEOs that I met. They knew kind of where it sort of was, but they were definitely very puzzled by why I was Singaporean. So, that was already a bit of a red flag for me. As a business journalist, I was like, oh, okay. But what was really interesting in Atlanta, what I liked so much is things were really plainly laid out for you to see. So I'll give you an example. In a newspaper, I worked at a newspaper. There were still newspapers back then, and our publisher would like us didn't want us to eat at our desks, so we were kind of forced to eat in this, break room area. And there were black tables and there were white tables. People would sit basically, and again, when you think about institutionalized racism, right? So I would go in and I would wonder where I would sit, because neither am I black nor am I white. And it was a very sort of weird, puzzling experience, but it was very stark. It was in your face. When I moved to Seattle, the racism is so subtle. The idea of what good immigrants and good people of color look like, it's so subtle, and yet nobody talks about it. And I think that's where it gets really, really difficult to start challenging the status quo, right? So when you work in tech and you're not invited for the happy hours because, maybe immigrants don't drink, or maybe they'll feel uncomfortable, or maybe you need to get home to your child, or whatever it is, when those sorts of ideas come into play, it becomes very difficult to challenge them, right? It's very difficult to challenge why you weren't invited. It's all sort of subtle, and it's under the radar, and it's very difficult to really confront them, because it's hard to talk about an idea that's an idea. It's not in your face. And that's where I really think Seattle will need to change. It really needs to start talking about some of the cultural norms we've adopted, and really think about also the Seattle freeze. I think we really need to think about unfreezing Seattle. And that means when new people come into the city, or even people who've lived for a long time, really think about welcoming them with opening arms, things like breaking bread, as I mentioned. I think there's a really big, strong part of that. And I think without talking about that and without telling these stories, we're not going to be able to disrupt these ideas that we already have. So that's sort of my answer to your first question. I like your second question a lot, so I don't want to miss it, and I know we're sort of short on time. Your second question, correct me if I'm wrong, was about, do you think that definition of a good immigrant and bad immigrant someday will switch, where a good immigrant is actually the one who challenges and a bad immigrant is actually one who doesn't? I think so much of it will depend on us changing our mindset as a society about what immigrants bring into this country. As a capitalist society, we've obviously been very laser focused in the sort of economic returns, how many immigrants start companies, how many immigrants, how much do we pay in taxes? I think until we don't shift out of that being our number one focus, when you really start focusing on the ideas of democracy and the ideas of press freedom. Unfortunately, we're sort of at this time where we've had to redefine these things. For a long time, we've been like, yeah, of course we're democratic, of course we have a free press. And now that so much of that is being questioned and being challenged by the place and time and history that we are in, I think we get to redefine that. And I would love to come to a place years from now where we can say that actually you came into this country and you didn't do anything about our press freedom issues. Wow, you're a bad immigrant. I would love that day to come. I don't think we're there yet. I still get a lot of sort of surprise. I have the privilege of having a spouse who works full-time in tech, and therefore I can go off and do a lot of voluntary work. And one of the hats I wear is I sit on the Seattle Women's Commission. We're an advisory board to the mayor and city council, and I can do that. I can volunteer my time to do that, right? And do it as an immigrant, but almost nobody else on the commission there with me is an immigrant. So I would love for us to talk about how immigrants can be civically engaged, how our voices can be heard, how we can bring that perspective into ideals like democracy and press freedom. So, yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much.